The moment we saw the looming silhouette of Blackwell Prison against the bruised evening sky, a chill crept into my bones. The building was massive, its ancient walls scarred with cracks and mildew, towering ominously in the middle of a dense forest. They called it the mouth of hell during its peak in the late 1800s. Known for its brutal torture practices, Blackwell Prison became infamous as a place where men vanished, not in the physical sense, but in spirit. I was here with my ghost hunting crew. Tom, our tech expert, Lila, our medium, and Scott, my best friend and the bravest among us. This prison had been abandoned for decades, forgotten and left to rot, but its reputation remained. As we unloaded our equipment, I saw movement in one of the upper windows. A dark figure, faceless, pressed up against the filthy glass, watching. I nudged Tom. "Did you see that?" I pointed, but the window was empty now, just a dark, dirty square against the prison's looming mass. It was almost dark now, and shadows were taking on strange shapes. The air inside Blackwell was thick, almost liquid in its weight. The silence pressed against our ears, broken only by the sound of our footsteps echoing through the halls. It smelled damp, like mold and decay, with an undertone of something else. Something metallic and sharp like old blood. "All right," Tom said, setting up his EMF meter and EVP recorder in the main hall. "If any spirits are here, feel free to let us know. We come in peace." His voice sounded almost mocking in the vast silence. Lila shivered and hugged herself. "I don't think we're alone here. I feel like something's watching us." Her voice was small, strained. "Yeah, like the whole place has eyes," Scott muttered, flicking his flashlight down a dark corridor. For a moment, I saw something at the end of it, just beyond his light's reach. A flicker of movement, then nothing. "All right, Scott and I will check out the old cells," I said. "Lila, Tom, you take the east wing. Keep in radio contact." We split up, and Scott and I headed down a narrow hallway lined with iron-barred cells. Each one was a hollow shell, but I could feel the suffering that had seeped into the walls. As we passed the cells, I started to feel something. It was as if each cell was alive, the air charged and whispering. Scott nudged me, his voice low. "Did you hear that?" I froze, straining to listen. First, there was just silence. Then I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper coming from the cell on our left. "Help me!" I shined my flashlight into the cell, heart pounding. But there was nothing there, only shadows, deep and consuming. I tried to ignore the prickling fear rising up my spine. Our investigation eventually led us to the basement, where the prison's torture chamber was rumored to be. The moment we opened the rusted door leading down, a wave of cold hit us. The stairs were narrow, slick with mildew, leading into a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow our flashlight's beams. As we descended, I felt the temperature drop even more. Tom and Lila's voices crackled over the radio. "Guys, are you getting weird readings?" "My EMF just spiked," Tom said, his voice distorted. Scott clicked his radio. "Yeah, we're picking up some weird activity down here." We reached the bottom and stepped into the torture chamber. The room was almost unbearably cold, and the smell was overwhelming. A sickening combination of damp stone and something that felt wrong, like the very walls were soaked in anguish. Chains and rusted tools lay scattered across a stone table in the center of the room. My flashlight passed over what looked like dried blood on the table's surface, caked and dark. I felt bile rise in my throat as I pictured what must have happened here. Suddenly, a faint scratching sound filled the room, like nails scraping over stone. I turned, shining my light around, but saw nothing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to rise from the floor itself, twisting around my mind. "Get out!" Scott's face turned pale. "Did you hear that?" We looked at each other, terrified. But before we could move, the door to the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were plunged into complete darkness. Panic flared up inside me as I scrambled toward the door, banging on it, but it wouldn't budge. I fumbled for my radio. "Tom, Lila, the door." The door closed on us. Scott grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. "Look," he whispered, his voice trembling. I turned and saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the room, barely visible in the darkness. A man, or what used to be a man, with his head hanging low and his hands bound in front of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could see dark stains, like dried blood, down his wrists. As we watched, he lifted his head, and his eyes met mine. They were empty, void of life, yet filled with a sorrow so deep it almost made me stagger. Then he spoke, his voice a hollow echo that bounced off the cold stone walls. "You shouldn't be here." Scott and I stood frozen, unable to look away. The figure took a step forward, his chains clinking as he moved, the sound piercing the silence. I wanted to run, scream, do anything but stand there, but my legs wouldn't move. A hand touched my shoulder, snapping me out of my trance. I turned to see Scott's terrified face. "Move!" he hissed, pulling me toward the door. We scrambled up the stairs, the air around us thick with something unseen, something angry. We could still hear the chains rattling behind us as we finally burst out into the main hallway, slamming the door shut. We regrouped with Tom and Lila, who had been frantically trying to reach us over the radio. "There's something evil down there." Tom looked at me, pale. "We heard screaming over the radio. We thought it was you." The van sat idling, its headlights illuminating only the stretch of cracked, overgrown road ahead of us. None of us dared move, the safety of the vehicle barely comforting after what we'd seen. The memory of that hollow figure in the basement, with his empty eyes and blood-streaked wrists, haunted my mind. Lila finally broke the silence. "We need to know what we're dealing with," she whispered, her voice shaking. "That wasn't just a ghost." Scott, who was usually the first to brush off more spiritual warnings, nodded grimly. "If we don't understand what that thing is, it might not let us go," he said. I kept feeling like it was watching us, even as we ran. "Let's figure out what," but from a distance, I suggested. "I'm not going back in there unless we know exactly what we're facing." We parked in the nearest small town, renting a room where we huddled around our equipment in a dingy motel room. Tom set up his laptop, uploading the audio recordings and running a spectral analysis on the sounds we'd captured. The recording from the basement played through the speakers, a distorted hum, faint at first but growing in intensity. Then we heard it, the low, guttural whisper again, deep and slow like it was speaking from beyond the grave. "Get out!" We all sat in silence, listening to the harsh, raspy words. But then, the recording continued, picking up a different voice. A faint, agonized scream that twisted into words, barely understandable. "Not free, cannot rest." Tom paused, glancing around. "This isn't just one ghost. It sounds like multiple spirits, like they're trapped." Lila's eyes widened. "This could be a residual haunting, but on a massive scale. And it's feeding off the pain that lingers in the prison." I shivered, remembering the torture chamber, the blood-stained table, and the iron chains that had rattled as we fled. So, the spirits of prisoners, they're stuck there, tied to whatever horrible things happened to them. Lila nodded slowly. "But there's something else. Something that feels darker. It's not a regular spirit. Maybe it's a warden, a torturer, something malevolent. Something powerful." Scott frowned, pulling up a crumbling folder of old prison records we'd retrieved earlier. I remember reading about Warden Fisk. They said he was brutal, used torture methods that weren't even legal back then. Some of the prisoners reportedly went insane before they died, driven mad by the pain and the confinement. Tom tapped his finger on the screen, pointing to a file from the prison's archives. Warden Fisk disappeared under mysterious circumstances, he said. One night he just vanished. No one found a trace of him. Rumor had it that he was killed by his own guards after one of his torture sessions went too far. Maybe it's him, I said. Maybe he's the one keeping these souls trapped. It'd explain the chains, the screaming. If Fisk became a twisted spirit himself, he could still be lording over the prisoners, holding them in eternal torment. A heavy silence settled over us, each of us lost in thoughts of what Warden Fisk must have been in life and what he'd become in death. It was clear we needed to do something. The air in the room felt charged, as if Blackwell's influence had seeped into the very walls around us. I had a gnawing feeling that if we didn't confront it, Fisk would follow us forever, a shadow lurking in our lives. The idea of going back into that prison felt suicidal, but we had little choice. Lila spoke first. There are rituals, ways to release spirits that are trapped. If we can break the hold Fisk has over them, maybe they'll be free. Tom started assembling our gear, salt, iron rods, and even a crucifix that Scott had brought just in case. We equipped our radios with backup batteries, charged our flashlights, and reviewed escape routes. None of us was going in unprepared. When dawn broke, we were already packed and ready. The plan was simple. Find anything connected to Fisk and destroy it, whether it was in the torture chamber, his office, or any other place he had ruled over his prisoners. If we could sever his attachment, the spirits might be freed. With hearts pounding, we returned to Blackwell Prison, stepping once again into the gaping mouth of the abandoned fortress. As we entered the main hall, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating dread. Shadows seemed to twist and writhe along the walls, dark and crawling, as if the prison itself were alive. Lila's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a bundle of sage. The torture chamber would be the last place we'd go. First, we headed to Warden Fisk's office, hoping to find some kind of artifact or personal item, a tether to his spirit. The office was just as we'd left it on our first walkthrough. Cold, dimly lit, with papers and broken furniture scattered across the floor. Tom rifled through the drawers, pulling out old ledgers filled with prisoners' names and brutal punishments marked in red ink. Then, his flashlight landed on a small, tarnished key with Fisk's name etched into the side. It felt heavy, radiating an unnatural warmth. Lila's eyes widened. This is it. It holds his energy, his connection to this place. Without hesitation, Scott grabbed the key, placing it on the ground. He poured a circle of salt around it, following Lila's instructions. But as he reached to break it with a hammer, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the room. The lights on our equipment started flashing wildly. The room grew freezing cold, and a shadow materialized in the corner. A tall, looming figure with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right into us. It was Fisk. His face was contorted, an expression of pure malice. "You think you can defy me?" His voice was like nails scraping against metal, low and grating. "I built this place. Every stone, every soul here belongs to me." Scott stepped back, the hammer slipping from his hand as Fisk moved closer, his shadow stretching over us. The walls seemed to close in, trapping us in a suffocating, unnatural darkness. "Destroy it," Lila yelled, her voice barely audible over the growing hum that filled the room, like the drone of angry bees. I grabbed the hammer, hands shaking, and brought it down on the key with all my strength. The metal cracked, sending a wave of cold energy rushing through the room. Fisk's scream pierced the air, a sound so twisted with rage and despair that it made my skin crawl. His shadow writhed and twisted, starting to fade as his connection weakened. But even as he disappeared, his voice echoed in the walls, seething with fury. "You can't release them. They belong to me, forever." The coldness ebbed, leaving a thick silence in its wake. But I knew it wasn't over. With Fisk's tether broken, we raced to the torture chamber, desperate to release the prisoners' souls before his influence could reform. The spirits, freed from his control, were restless, their voices whispering through the air in faint, broken pleas. Lila led us in a ritual, lighting the sage and chanting words of release. She moved through the chamber, sweeping the smoke over the iron chains and the blood-stained table, the marks of suffering that had held the spirits in torment for so long. The air grew heavy, vibrating with energy as each spirit released a final, breathless sigh, their voices mingling in a soft, sorrowful chorus. The room began to glow faintly, as if a soft, ethereal light was breaking through the walls. And then, in a burst of warmth, they were gone. The silence that followed felt pure, almost serene. The darkness that had weighed so heavily on Blackwell Prison finally lifted, replaced by an emptiness that was almost peaceful. We knew the spirits were free. Yet, as we stood in the hollow shell of what had once been a place of unimaginable suffering, reality began to set in. We had to document everything, every detail, every trace that might confirm what we'd witnessed. Scott exhaled a long breath. "We can't leave without proof," he murmured. We nodded, glancing around at the eerie calm of the room, where a low fog of cold still lingered, as if Fisk's presence had only just departed. Tom pulled out his camera, snapping photos of the torture chamber's walls, floors, and even the air, hoping to catch some lingering manifestation of the spirits. The walls bore faint handprints, smeared and hazy, as if pressed there by unseen hands. There were marks on the cold, damp stone, finger trails that had never belonged to any of us, dragging toward the iron chains and restraints that lay abandoned. Each print seemed stamped with desperation, as though ghosts had clung to the walls, hoping to escape even after death. "I'm picking up something on the EMF," Tom whispered, eyes wide as his monitor spiked, capturing residual energy in pulses. Lila walked slowly toward a large window, wiping away years of grime. "Look," she said softly, pointing to smudged fingerprints on the glass, small and narrow as if pressed by frail hands reaching for freedom. These could have been from prisoners who spent their final moments here, dreaming of a world beyond, or from the guards or Fisk himself, Scott added darkly, snapping photos of the grimy window, where the fingers appeared almost skeletal in shape. In one corner of the room, we found a broken comb and an old, tarnished ring. A thin band with the initials FF scratched inside the metal. It was unmistakably Warden Fisk's, an object that carried his energy, his aura of cruelty. I slipped it into a plastic evidence bag, feeling a prickle of unease as I touched it. Even the objects here seemed to hum with some echo of what had transpired. We collected the hammer I'd used to break the key, still coated with dust and tiny fragments of metal. I bagged it, thinking of the way Fisk's spirit had recoiled at its destruction, his essence tied so closely to that small, rusted object. Tom ran a black light over the table in the center of the chamber, revealing smears and trails of dried residue that glowed faintly under the ultraviolet. "It's all here," he said, almost reverently, snapping more photos, as if every last piece of their suffering has been recorded in this place, waiting for someone to notice. We moved from room to room, documenting every sign, every trace. On some walls, we found scratches so deep they'd gouged into the stone, frantic marks as if from someone clawing to get out. In the cells, old beds held indentations as though spirits had lain there just minutes before, the impression of their torment forever carved into the mattress frames. Finally, we returned to Fisk's office, where the faint outlines of boot prints and handprints marred the dust on his desk. The ledger he had once used still lay open, and we captured each page with our cameras, recording his precise, brutal notes. The floor near the desk held prints, smudged, pale traces that seemed to shift under the light, marking where Fisk had stood, watching us, before his spirit was banished. When we finished, we stood in silence, taking in the weight of what we had witnessed and captured. The artifacts we gathered, photos, fingerprints, old objects tainted by Fisk's influence, were grim reminders that evil had indeed resided here, but that it was finally laid to rest. We left Blackwell as the sun began to rise, driving away with our evidence and, we hoped, a story that others would believe. The ghosts had been expelled, but they left behind a reminder, etched into walls, pressed into the dust, and wrapped in fingerprints, that their suffering had been real.